Hello, everyone. Welcome to another edition of The Orthodox Nationalist. This is Matthew Raphael Johnson. Today is December 24th, 2019. For most in the Western world, that's Christmas Eve. For those on the old calendar, it is not. It's just an ordinary day. I want to make a point that those of you who are blessed with a family, that are blessed with a community, that are blessed with social support, I ask you, please visit people who don't have that. There's nothing more brutal than spending Christmas alone. I grew up over my father's funeral home in New Jersey, and from the middle of December to maybe the middle to the end of January, we saw a spike of deaths every year, no question, to the point where we simply were turning people away. That happened every year. Every funeral director will tell you that that's the case. And it's not the weather. It's obviously not the weather because it falls off in the middle of January. And you still have the rest of January, February, parts of March. And prior to that, you have the first half of December. No, it's just around Christmas time. And I firmly believe that this has to do with depression. This has to do with a loss of a will to live for those who don't have anybody. I don't know if there have been any studies done on this, but the weather, if it's related at all, can't be a major factor. Because it's only in this, really 4 weeks that we roughly call the holiday season, but of course we're referring to Christmas. Christmas and New Year's. And the tremendous stress that the regime places on us. And people, are forced to socialize with families, which on the surface sounds good, but because we're egotists, it often isn't good. It's something that we don't look forward to, because family doesn't exist. When the Western world has forced the ego as the foundation of society, which is an absurdity, when of course the extended family is the foundation of society, the only foundation of society that makes any sense. And that of course coexists with the nation, because even the extended family can exist on its own. But an egocentric society can't function at the same time as a family. It took a while, but the family is now dying. Even today, marriage rates are the lowest they've ever been. Young people simply are not getting married. Now, we know why men aren't getting married. We know what happens during divorce. There's a reason that 80 to 90% of divorces are instituted by women. But that's not the full story, because falling in love is not a rational process. When you're in love, it is not. You really don't know what you're doing. It's like you're drunk. And if you don't know what I'm talking about, then you haven't been in love. It is not rational. Please, if you're with people, visit people who are alone, or people who are in prison, or people who are in the hospital. Because the death spike in the holiday season exists, not because it's cold, but because people have lost the will to live. Because there's nothing worse than this. This is supposed to be a time where the community gets together, the extended family gets together, and those of us who don't have that suffer greatly. And I can't imagine what it's like to be in prison or in the hospital during this time. So I ask you to please, even if you don't even know these people, I don't care, just go and do it. It's not supposed to be pleasant. It's for them, not for you. Now, I would like to continue to talk a bit about 18th century Russia. Now, as you know, this has been an overarching, almost an obsession of mine from the day this show was created. I believe the second show I ever did was on Peter the Great. both in the Voice of Reason era and the Radio Albion era. This has been an overarching concern. It's been a huge contribution that I've made to Russian Orthodox studies and Russian history in general. And it has to do with essentially what happens after the new rite is introduced to the Russian Orthodox liturgy under the reign of Tsar Alexis. The problem here is that there is no distinction between the liturgical and the social and the economic and the psychological. That's a modern distinction. You can't separate those things in a time like Russia. These are all one and the same. The liturgy is as economic as it is religious, as it is political, as it is familial, as it is psychological. They're, of course, different disciplines, but they're simply different ways of looking at the exact same thing. I spend a lot of time talking about Peter and his successors for a bunch of reasons. Number one, because it's not understood very well by Orthodox people. Oh, and by the way, I've said this before, but people aren't listening to me. There is no such phrase as Orthodox Christian. That's not only is it a misnomer, but it's a neologism. Orthodox Catholic is the proper title for an Orthodox man. Somehow, and I don't precisely know how this occurred, but somehow the Uniates took the name Greek Catholic. In the 18th century, it was, Greek Catholic, Roman Catholic. Then there were Old Catholics and Anglo-Catholics. But Orthodox Christian is very vague and doesn't refer, even Seraphim Rose used the term. Has nothing to do with, somehow the Uniates were able to do this. And the term Uniate, by the way, is not a pejorative. Uniates can think it is because they're told that it is. So, I know I've said this before, but it really irritates me. There is no such entity. That's simply incorrect. The other reason, of course, is how complex it is. It is the most complex part of Russian history. It's the most difficult part for most people to understand. And there's so much about the Russian tradition that derives from this era, either positive or negative, that has to be dealt with. The third reason, of course, is that it raises some serious questions. There is a interruption in the church succession as well as in the royal succession. Those lines were at least temporarily broken. And this is one of the reasons that Russian Orthodox people have trouble dealing with the 18th century. They're so concerned with legality that they fear that admitting a break in succession means that they're somehow illegitimate, as if God is subject to the whims of Peter the Great. Bishops are not the church. Bishops are not the apostolic succession. They may represent it sometimes, but they're not even people. They're offices, and their offices, of course, are subordinate. They're communal. It doesn't refer to an individual. People talk about the Western infiltration. They're talking about sort of modern institutionalized thinking that's become part of Orthodox life, and it's simply false. But westernized ways of thinking, in the worst sense, in the modern sense, because when we refer to the West, we have to be very careful what we mean. We're not referring to scholasticism, or we're not referring to Plato. We're referring to Plato is as Eastern as he is Western as far as Europe is concerned. You have to be very careful. We're talking about the modern capitalist Hobbesian state, deriving from the revolutionary state of nature idea, which is connected, of course, to the much later will to power. But that ideology was forcibly imposed on Russia in this era. Liberals, left liberals, of course, that is the official ideology of the Western world right now, and you'll end up in prison if you don't accept it, eventually, in one way or another. They struggle with this idea because they're forced to admit that liberalism never, ever has been voluntarily accepted by a people. It has to be violently imposed. Mainline historians have come up with the concept of enlightened absolutism. The very fact that that's such a bizarre phrase shows you that they really don't know how to deal with this very well. And this is the reason why. Karl Marx, in his essay on free trade, supported free trade because it destroyed traditional forms of economic life. It destroyed differences between nations, among nations. So it forcibly creates an international globalist view that then the Marxists can take over. And he was very explicit about this. The so-called enlightened absolutists are similar in the sense that their job is to destroy traditional institutions so that liberals can then do away with them and take over themselves. All the so-called enlightened absolutists were concerned with intense centralization of power, the destruction of local democracies, and these were ancient, very legitimate institutions, making the church a department of the state or an arm of liberalism, which essentially is atheism, because it's not, the state is all that matters. The church then kind of mystifies it. So at some point, the merchant classes begin wondering why they're taking orders and seek to take over themselves. A republic is the idea of the killing of the king. In its purest form, it's what happens when the kids kill the dad and then start fighting among each other about what to do with all of the spoils. The problem that they have is only the dad has the authority to rule. They don't, and they know this. And this is, of course, Machiavelli's sole obsession in his entire life was to explain how to manipulate people and hopefully keep them from understanding that you don't actually have the right to rule them. A republic is how the kids, so to speak, the merchant classes, those with money, those who have no concern with the public good whatsoever, are able to divide the spoils that others have created. That's why it's an adversarial system, because these people technically are in competition with one another. So I also think what we did last week, I went through, as always, a lot of things very, very quickly, and I didn't really flesh out the complexities of the era very much. There was a lot that I mentioned, the foreign occupation, so-called Catherine I, the foundation of Petersburg, the Masons, all this kind of thing. Let me flesh that out a bit more. The 18th century, it's not crazy to say that the 18th century is a foreign occupation state in Russia, with, of course, the exception of Elisabeth. As I've already said, the Old Believers really took the bulk of their ideology comes from rejecting that. This was then associated with the New Right. The New Right's connected with empire building in the Western secular sense, not in the national sense, as had existed prior to this. What Peter the Great ultimately did was create a small, mostly foreign, ruling class in distant St. Petersburg around a new group of people he called the so-called service nobility. Many of them were foreigners. They weren't all foreigners, but many of them were. And Peter created the myth that Russia, up until him, was backwards, was primitive, which is nonsensical. It simply isn't true. And therefore, Russia desperately needed him and his new ruling class, or else they would have fallen behind and been, I assume, absorbed and destroyed. I don't have time here to go into the Gnostic ideology behind the foundation of St. Petersburg and what it is. But in a more practical sense, it's a way to isolate the ruling class. Because what Peter and his successors are going to do is simply grind up the population with endless warfare and very, very high taxes. Now, Peter died in 1725. Immediately, you had a factional, two factions developed at least. Now, again, I'm not going to, Catherine I is such a mockery, as I've said 100 times. But Peter also created the Senate, which was a Senate almost in the Roman sense. It was, of course, very aristocratic, that supported Catherine I just to use her as a puppet, which is all she ever knew and all she was capable of. She wasn't really married to Peter. She wasn't Orthodox. She didn't know where she was. And most of the Senate early on said that. Then, of course, you had Old Russia, which was the overwhelming majority of the population. And this revolved around, I think I mentioned before, Peter II. And he died at a young age. He was about 15. He died of smallpox. And he is the son of Tsar Alexis' daughter, Natalia. Alexis being Peter I's son, the man who was tortured to death by his father. Sorry. Not the earlier Tsar. The Tsarevich Alexis was Peter's son, and Peter II came from him being, so therefore, Peter the Great's grandson. And I'm not going to, I'm not going to get into, the whole substitution theory. It's irrelevant because the ideology is the same no matter what. So the Senate declares for Catherine I. And so now, for the first time in Russian history, you have a puppet ruler with an oligarchy behind it. An oligarchy always needs a puppet ruler. Now, I think the exception to that is today. The revelation of the method. The idea that we are so debased that an oligarchy can openly rule and no one will do anything. The ultimate in liberal power and establishment power. But back then that was out of the question. There were constant uprisings, just like there were at the foundation of the U.S. Constitution, which again aren't dealt with very much. One of Catherine's lovers, that's all, again, she was just a mattress. Prince Menshikov was her favorite. And he wanted to take over and place his daughter in the royal family. And he's the one who's ruling in place of Catherine I, but he's still the head of a larger oligarchy. So really, it's a regency. So you have the development of the economy in the sense that they created the Russian Academy of Sciences. They created the cult of personality around Peter. And, he wasn't a very popular ruler. So again, for the first time, you have this very modern cult of personality that's created. And they try to present him to the population as like a Roman emperor. You have an explosion of westernized newspapers. You have a reorganization of the Russian aristocracy. And in foreign policy, you had a treaty with the Austrian Empire to control Prussia, which of course is a rising power. Now, I've said in the past that Germany and Russia have far more in common than they do in opposition. But at the time, Austria was needed to control this rising power. And Menshikov, of course, is close to Peter and to the Senate and to the Petrine organization as a whole. And he viewed himself not just as a regent for the very sick Catherine, but as the actual ruler of the state. So Peter II, was being essentially raised by those loyal to the Menshikov organization. He even called himself the Russian equivalent of Generalissimo of the Russian Empire. And the only people who really backed him were the aristocracy. And like all of these guys, when I say aristocracy, there's legitimate aristocracy, there's oligarchs. So he made himself very unpopular. And Peter II, between 1725, 1727, even as a boy, Peter was rebelling against Menshikov's rule and against the Petrine legacy. Now, Elisabeth, who we dealt with last week, was his aunt, who vehemently disliked Menshikov. But when you're very unpopular and you have no right to rule, one important thing you have to do is start bringing in foreigners, which was Peter's overarching obsession. So after Catherine I finally died of cirrhosis of the liver, due to her alcoholism, Menshikov was arrested. The army seemed to support Peter II. And the aristocratic clan behind Peter II was the Dologorky family. So you have two groups of aristocrats. The Dologorkys were far more aristocratic than oligarchic, but they both certainly are very powerful and have a lot of money. But that means central control, central power has fallen, has disintegrated. And when that happens, Sweden and Prussia developed the idea that Russia might be carved out. Without that solid rule, without that firm, centralized authority, Russia's enemies are going to swoop in very, very quickly. But the basis of legitimacy is what's essential. Peter II, very explicitly, even as a very young man, called himself the representative of old Russia, the anti-Peter, which was very important and made him popular right away. And he married into the Dologorky's family. They wanted an agrarian Russia, not a European empire, is the way to put it. So you have Menshikov ruling in place of Catherine. You have Dologorky clan ruling in place of Peter II. But even there, Peter II rebelled against them, rejecting all forms of oligarchy, whether legitimate or not. But of course, 17 years old, 1730, he dies. The Menshikovs were pro-Austrian, and that automatically put them against Prussia. The other aspect of this, of course, is the other side of the world, building an alliance with the Far East. An alliance with Prussia, which of course was something that Peter accepted. So one was the Menshikovs were pro-Austrian. Peter II and the Dologorkys were pro-Prussian. Pro-Prussia, as we find out later on, makes a heck of a lot more sense than being pro-Austrian. And that makes a lot more sense, of course, when Germany's unified much later. Confident in that relationship, he then wants to build an alliance with the Chinese. And the Eastern legacy wasn't significant in Russian lives since Ivan the Terrible. And it wasn't, they didn't make a huge distinction between China and Japan at the time, or the Muslims even of Central Asia. But just like today, the future was seen to be there. So this division in Russian society was whether Russia is Eastern or Western. An Eastern, Orthodox agrarian society, with not with an insignificant industrial base. That's a necessity, but it doesn't have to dominate the life of the nation. Which is then would be allied with the nations to the east. Then, 1730, 1741, you have what I've called in the past the rule of the two Annas. This is where you have the Masonic rule. You have the complete disintegration of the Russian state. Petersburg didn't have a foundation, actually quite literally didn't have a foundation. It was a so-called floating city. And so when that power center falls, you have nothing left. And so you have the overwhelming majority of the peasantry believing that the Russian monarchy had fallen entirely. Catherine I had no right to rule whatsoever. Peter the Great, if it really was Peter the Great, was a Freemason anyway. And it didn't matter because he was no longer Orthodox. And that put a Masonic, a westernized modernist stamp on the state. You can't be a legitimate monarch of Russia and not be Orthodox. So that means old Russia had to go underground. And unfortunately, the early death of Peter II made that permanent. Now, the Senate was, in Peter's mind, an advisory body. It was essentially appointees of Peter. Essentially were the richest aristocrats of the realm. It sort of acted like a Supreme Court. So after the death of Peter II, both clans, Menshikov and Dolgorky, were out of power and considered disgraced. The rest of them were in the Senate, and they had full control. After the death of Peter II, they drew up what we might want to call a constitution. So they bring in Anna of Courland as a puppet, and they want to create, a constitutional oligarchy, really, ruled by the Senate. It was essentially these, a lot of them are foreign, Petrine oligarchs of St. Petersburg. So Anna is brought in from Courland to Russia, and the following conditions are given to her. Again, this is classic oligarchy. The Senate at the time had 8 members. She has to rule with them. She is essentially their servant, but that's not how they put it. Any declaration of war, which is extremely important, of course, has to be done by the Senate. She could rubber stamp it, but the Senate has to declare it. The monarch cannot confiscate the property of the rich under any circumstances unless the Senate approves it. This is important for a whole lot of reasons. Ivan the Terrible crushed the oligarchs by, not by killing them, but by selling off their lands and sending them into exile. If Anna dies, or if she is sick or resigns, the Senate has to choose a successor. And of course, if any of these are violated, she'll be removed from office. Now, the average American who looks at this and says, oh, this is a wonderful thing. Russia's finally progressing and becoming English. We're all supposed to be becoming English. The lower classes were outraged. This was the issue of the day. A very powerful group that people forget about, the lower nobility, which from an economic point of view was no different than the peasantry. They just had more responsibilities. They didn't view these as constitutional. They viewed them as a limitation of canon law, the limitation of natural law, the limitation of the church, the limitation of traditional monarchy. Especially when these people are in isolated St. Petersburg. It's a collective dictatorship. Now, very typical of these kind of Republican movements, and they were instituting a republic. This is what a republic is. The fact that they use Anna as a spokesmodel is of no consequence. She at least wasn't always drunk and on drugs like Catherine was. What they said can't be done to them, they do to everybody else. So as all of this is going on, they continue to raise taxes, which of course Peter the Great did. Russia is ridiculously, it's taxed beyond belief. There's arrears everywhere. They confiscated property, they exiled lower noble families in the countryside, and you had open warfare between the Muscovite idea and the Petersburg idea, between monarchy and aristocracy. Now, once the Senate gets wind of this, that is to say that there is this anger, that you have nobles in the countryside who are very angry, they put Anna under heavy guard. Now, she had just converted to Orthodoxy. She didn't convert because she wanted to. She converted because she couldn't be Empress without it. So when someone is just formally Orthodox, just as a formality, they're not Orthodox. You can only come into the church if you are legitimately convinced of it. But she had just converted. And her confessor was Bishop Theophan, who in fact was a traditional monarchist and opposed the Senate and the nobility. And through Theophan, the church was in secret communication with Anna and urged her to reject these conditions and rule as an actual popular monarch in her own right. She's smart enough to realize that if she does this, it'll be very much like Putin in the early 2000s. You start throwing these people in prison, you'll be more popular and have a legitimate right to rule. Going back to the mentality of old Russia, which was very easily done at the time, because everyone else was still living there. It's just a small ruling class that wasn't. Be very easy to do, would give her a foundation for power that these so-called conditions and the Senate could never give her. The Senate was just created by Peter. It's not a venerable institution. So she calls the Senate to order, and with her is about 800 people. Well, this 800 people had come from all over Russia. They weren't all wealthy. You had some Cossacks there. You had many clergy there. This 800 people was far more representative as a body than the Senate. And they demanded that the Senate be rejected and Anna rule in her own right. So the senators were exiled, the Dologorky clan was exiled. So two of the most important, probably the richest clans in Russia have been exiled and their property has been confiscated. Anna then makes a giant mistake. She has no real connections in Russia. She's not Russian, despite her relation to Peter. The only people who she thinks she could trust are those from her native Germany. This is where Lord Byron came from her hometown. And he took over the state. Anna could have ruled in her own right, but wouldn't. She brought in her own foreign oligarchy from Germany to rule Russia for this period of time. The Germans, and again I've said this many times before, the Germans recreated the army. They tightened military discipline. They tightened tax collection. They sent taxes through the roof. They created new education systems, formal examinations. They created kind of like the Russian West Point for officers. And therefore, the average Russian citizen is, war after war, high taxes, all this dumped on them. And again, tax collection is one thing, but this is not for, this is for their own glory, not for the state. They're being driven farther away from any kind of loyalty to the monarchy. It's fair to say that at this point, the Russian monarchy had no popular support. And this is why, as I've said before, the Old Believers continued their secret agitation that there was no Russian monarchy anymore. And by the way, many years ago I covered a lot of these topics. This is not necessarily new. This is a new edition. The post-Petrine world, which I did, a decade ago, and I'm kind of reprising and restating and even changing a few of my views from back then. That needs to be done. This is sort of a second edition of a much older topic, but an extremely important one. But the Old Believers were now at a point, therefore the majority of the peasantry, where there was no Russian monarchy at this point. And because they were Old Believers, they didn't believe that there was any Russian church anymore either. Anyway, Anna had another successor, also named Anna of Holstein, who was worse. She spent so much money on her lovers, clothing, paintings, architects she brought in from Italy, while taxes were massively high, and the peasants and low-level nobles were massively in debt. This is where the Old Believer revolutionaries came from. Old Russia had fallen, the monarchy didn't exist, and they need to form underground communities in the forests, the mountains, Siberia, and preserve Russia until a true Orthodox monarch can come and rule, which, of course, no one was holding their breath for that. So after Anne died, Germans wanted to maintain, of course, their control over the state. So they imported Anna of Holstein. She was the mother of yet another Freemason, Peter III, and yet again was another figurehead. So what began to happen is that German factions brought German politics from Holstein and elsewhere into Russia, or into Petersburg, and fought one another for the privilege of overtaxing the Russian peasantry. So now you have, ruling the state, you've had four, not accepting Peter II. You've had four non-Orthodox rulers in a row. Peter, Catherine, the two Annes. Peter II ruled for a very short time, but he is definitely an exception. So you have four. So that succession is broken. You've had non-Orthodox rule over Russia now for a generation. And of course, as this is going on, the church is being purged. The church was purged over and over and over again. Church lands were taken and sold and for speculation and everything else. It was no different than Henry VIII. Just wasn't quite as systematic. The Germans took control through Byron. And those, again, like Anna, he brought from his small duchies to the east, Holstein, Courland. And Anna showed no activity whatsoever. She had men, she had booze, she had dresses. That was enough for her. She was a Kardashian. Said Kardashian is not a head of state. So that's what she was there for. And of course, the Old Believers were right. Within a few years, there'll be 7/8 of the peasantry and the entire Cossack movement. And like we mentioned last week, that's when Elisabeth finally showed herself until her death in 1762. Now notice, I mentioned that the Germans have taken over. This is noticed in other parts of the world. And one place that it's noticed is France. That means Elisabeth was promoted with French money. To a great extent, this is where the French obsession with the Russian upper classes began. And money from France is what bribed the soldiers to bring her to power. Again, I said last week, she didn't come to power in the best of conditions, but legality had collapsed. There is no legality in, the 1740s. Anna died in prison in 1746. The Germans were cleansed of St. Petersburg. So it didn't take much to cleanse them out of the area. Germans are wonderful people, but in Germany. This is why in 1741 she wrote her resolution against foreign rule. The two nations that supported her, were the French and the Swedes. And you had some anti-German propaganda for people to rise up against the Germans. So this is a popular issue. This isn't just an aristocratic faction. Elisabeth did double-cross the Swedes, though, and defeated their armies in Northeast Europe. And so the Franco-Russian alliance was very tight. And the only time this was really interrupted was in 1812. Well, and Napoleon III in the Crimean War. And this, unfortunately, will to some extent lead to World War I. It didn't have to happen, but this is a piece of the puzzle. So the Franco-Russian alliance forced the British to create their own faction at court. But more importantly, the British began backing the Austrians. And this is why Austria became the main enemy of Russia from here on in. Or one of the main enemies of Russia from here on in. As we all know, Prussia was growing so fast that it was affecting the balance of power. But in 1757, the Russians defeated them in open battle. It was General Alexei Betushev, who was the commander of the Russian forces, and also was foreign minister under Elisabeth. And his job was to surround Prussia with enemies. And of course, this was done in union with the French. However, the defeat of Prussia by the Russians frightened the French. Anytime you have the power, either with a very strong military victory, showing that they're well led, or massive economic growth, which was happening under Elisabeth, which was happening in Prussia at the time, other nations are frightened. So, very quickly, you have this very strange alliance of Vienna, Paris, and London this is how seriously they took Elisabeth. That they're willing to put their enmity aside for the sake of organizing against her. So, of course, when she dies, the Prussian faction now is emboldened. And it coalesced, unfortunately, around Peter III. Peter III would have been a wonderful monarch in Prussia. He was a Prussian nationalist who was kind of hoisted onto the Russian throne, the grandson of Catherine the Drunk, and therefore the son of the first Anna. He was made monarch, however, by Elisabeth. As part of the process of making peace with Prussia, after Russia had defeated Prussia many, many times. And was growing just as fast as Prussia was economically. He made himself very unpopular. And this is what happens. He allied himself with Frederick II. And due to Frederick's advice, and we know his connection with Freemasonry and everything else, a central plank in their platform was to free the nobility from state service. At the very least, Peter the Great demanded that nobles put their fortunes behind state power. At least he had that going for him. At least, as serfdom is becoming intensified, there's some solace in the sense that they have just as many responsibilities as the peasantry does. But because Peter III was so worried about his own popularity with the elites in Petersburg, By freeing the nobility from state service, he guaranteed their support. So what does that mean? If the Russian nobility, which was actually repopulated with actual Russians under Elisabeth, doesn't have to serve the state anymore, that means a brand new bureaucracy of professional civil servants will be created, again, mostly foreigners. So with the stroke of a pen, Peter III, as I said before, made the Russian nobility irrelevant. Peter III was also a Freemason. He was just as bad as Byron was. He brought all things Prussian to Petersburg. Very much like Byron, he despised the Orthodox Church. It didn't take long, though. He was eventually murdered by his own guard and young officers in northern Russia. You can't be a Russian ruler and be anti-Orthodox for very long. The French had a certain popularity in Russia that the Prussians never had. There were a couple of things, though, and I think I mentioned this many years ago, and it doesn't seem significant for us today, but at the time, he imported beets into Russia, no doubt from Scranton, Pennsylvania. And that means that Russia now had a local source of sugar. That's a big deal. That was one of the big problems against Russian autarky. To be autarkic was that they had a sugar problem. The sugar beet plantations became a huge part of Russian agriculture. A very positive thing he did also is that he reversed the policy of bringing serfs into industry. I think I said this last week, that forcing serfs to work in industrial concerns was a disaster. This is almost a Stalinist move. It wasn't widely enforced, of course. And near the end, he abolished the secret police. So, and he officially tolerated the old belief because he really didn't care one way or the other. If they were to attack the mainstream church, he was happy with them. So ultimately, he was destroyed in a coup run by Catherine the Great, Catherine II. Now, I want to backtrack a little bit and recap a few things about Peter. Peter the Great was Russia's first revolutionary. He was very explicit about this. You can't be revolutionary without being modern, because there was no concept of this prior. The state was never powerful enough prior to this to create a revolution. And we're not just talking about a change of the guard. The American Revolution wasn't a revolution, it was a war of independence. No, revolution wants to completely rip up society by its roots and replace it with something else. It's something that really can't be done. And certainly can't be done quickly, if it can be done at all. And therefore, violence is absolutely necessary. So it's not just Peter purged the church, he purged the entire society. This is why bringing in foreigners was extremely significant. This is why the Masonic lodges were so significant. And something that is very unpleasant to talk about, but the other thing that was very significant was his all-drunken synod. I've talked about this before. It's unpleasant only because some of it is so vile that I can't really say it online. It was more or less a secret society. It was satanic. They worshipped the god Dionysius. They had their own hierarchy. They had their own bylaws. They had hymns. They had liturgies. And it usually revolved around alcohol. They had their own language, had their own jargon, so to speak. And of course, with female members, sexuality, orgies became a regular occurrence. This is how he broke down the morality of the court. You couldn't be faithfully married in Peter's court at the time, because the alcohol was so severe, and of course what happened afterwards would destroy any marriage. So you had to simply be good with it, or you couldn't rule with Peter. This is where Peter built his aristocracy. This was far greater than the Senate. This was far greater than even, rich people. You had the so-called abbesses and abbots in this old drunken sobor at the time, servants of Bacchus, as they were called. And sometimes these ceremonies were public. And they would get drunk and they would have these processions in the streets mocking the church, mocking the mocking processions, mocking the procession of Palm Sunday, for example. They'd ride a pig, they'd ride, there's things to mock the concept. The important thing, that this revolution, like, in fact, all revolutions, is based on sexual liberation. What this old drunken sobor means is that you couldn't be a part of Peter's ruling class, that is, the ruling class, unless you engaged in these practices. Unless you engaged in these practices, there's simply no other way to do it. Alcoholism was rampant, and the fact that you say and do things when you're drunk that you later regret, this becomes a mechanism, a weapon. This is also how we know that people usually tell the truth when they're drinking. This is how Peter can ensure that he's surrounded by people he can trust. Because Peter, being so big, being so tall, could drink a lot more than his elites could. So this is, it's very significant. It doesn't get a lot of treatment in the literature because this is one of the ways that liberalism was imposed on the ruling class by the resurrection of this pagan ritual. It lasted for about 30 years. It was a deliberate parody of the hierarchy of the church. They would occasionally complain. I mean, St. Petersburg had pagan statues all over the place. And it was St. Mitrophant who had complained about this. Usually he would be purged. He wasn't. Peter liked them. So he took some of them down. Then he complained about the old drunken synod. And Peter responded by saying, oh, this is not a mockery of the Orthodox, this is a mockery of Catholicism. Which, of course, no one actually believed. They even had their own vestments. Instead of the bishop's panagia, they would have a flask on a chain around their necks. That was their big, like you wear a cross or an icon of Mary. That's what they would wear. And they would have, the taxpayer money was put into this. An image of Bacchus would be engraved in it. You don't see this anywhere. This has nothing to do with like the buffoon guilds, the Hellfire Club. No, this is not that. Because this was done by the ruler himself. This was done as a direct mockery of the church that he hated. When they had a prince pope, which they would elect every once in a while when they got really wasted, and this is the laying on of hands ceremony. They would say this: I ordain X, the old drunk, this drunk in the name of all drunkards, in the name of all the grains, meaning the grain alcohol, in the name of all fools, in the name of all jesters, in the name of all freaks, in the name of vodka, in the name of all the wines, of all the beers, of the honey, the karazins, which is a raspberry vodka, the name of the kvass, the name of all the barrels, buckets, mugs, in the name of all the cards, of all the bones, of all tobacco, in the name of all the taverns and bars, the home of our father Bacchus. Amen. Now, one of the translations in here, I said, in the name of all the bones, it is actually a cross of bones. In other words, the skull and crossbones was one of their symbols. And Russian writers, anyway, will say that this is an integral part of Peter's revolutionary idea. This was the vanguard party. This is not just parody. This is not just theater. This was a creation of a new ideology. It was a way to select his revolutionary people. They would pass the test for obedience. He knew he could trust them. Because when you're drinking, you tell the truth. They even considered the drunken state as the spirit touching us. So what we've been talking about really in these last two lectures is the nature of revolution itself. Now, last week we dealt with the interruption of that revolution, the counter-revolutionary movement of Elisabeth. And in that particular case, and of course this is France prior to the revolution. What they were fighting, what Elisabeth was trying to resurrect, what Peter and his drunken synod and these other nonsensical things, the very powerful things, was old Russia. The Cossacks, who in Ivan Mazepa was Peter's great enemy. Wealthy Cossacks who were settled, supported the monarchy in Petersburg. The rank and file supported leaving Russia. The old Cossack liberties, the old communal understandings, the old believers. And of course, they eventually were allied with Charles in Sweden and failed. Sweden was defeated in 1709, and Ukraine absorbed more tightly into the Russian Empire. Sweden was never a major military power ever again. But it's just in this era that he's seizing churches and monasteries. He's melting down everything. He's taking chalices. He's melting it all down, claiming that he needs it for cannon and bullets and everything else to finance his war with Charles. Lenin said the same thing. We need to melt this stuff down so we could sell it to get money to feed the poor. It's the exact same thing. This is why people thought that he was possessed. Russia was not a country that drank a lot prior to Peter. As far as anyone can tell, there's a few studies on this. The least drunk country in Europe, up until, let's say, 1750, was Norway. Russia was just above that. So it was the very opposite of an alcoholic society. Peter brought alcohol and tobacco into Russian life. He brought the idea of a palace coup into Russian life. He brought the idea of a secret police into Russian life. And the idea that tax rates don't have to be stable, that you could raise them and raise them and raise them to do whatever you need to do. The whole point of absorbing the churches and bulldozing some of these was so he could sell this land. He brought the idea of forced labor into Russia. Serfdom prior to Peter was not forced labor. The peasantry works the land. They're wedded to it. They always have been. So the defeat of the Cossacks against the Swedes is one of the things that allowed Peter to enslave them to build St. Petersburg. The old noble families were destroyed. We talked about this, where there was only, a handful left. There were two, Menshikov and Dologorky, as we mentioned before, and even they eventually were broken. So a new aristocracy had to be created in its place in the new service state that was built in the middle of the century. The unholy drunken synod that had various names over the years developed around the same time he abolished the patriarchate. There were the purges of the church. By the time he died, every major see had been purged, and one of Peter's friends was installed. The two big purges, the first one was in 1698, the second one in 1718. No one's quite sure how many bishops and clergy were executed, but it was many. But in making the clergy essentially employees of the state with a state salary, he made them a closed caste, and the priesthood had a tendency then to go from father to son. Priests were ordered to report to the state on the moral condition of their parishioners, which really meant to see if there's any old believers, if there's any who are at war with the state. Peter eliminated monastery after monastery after monastery. But it's not just monasteries. Monasteries were the libraries of the empire, the schools of the empire. They were the repositories of ancient wisdom. So shutting down monasteries was shutting down that. Only a handful of monks remained by the time Peter died in 1725. These monks were then drafted into the army. They were immediately defrocked and drafted into the army. He had a purged church who rubber-stamped this. He had constant warfare, so he needed soldiers. Anyone who irritated him was sent straight into the army. Thousands of priests and monks were removed from their position and drafted. The Bolsheviks did the exact same thing. Monastic property was seized in the same way that it did under the Bolsheviks. Western educational forms were imported from Poland, and the parish lost all of its autonomy. Everyone was now installed by the center. The attack on the parish was the attack on local government. The royal state, prior to Peter the Great, was never absolute. It had some taxing ability, a relatively small army. Almost everything was done at the local level. This is classic medievalism. It's based on the dispersion of power. People bound together by a common language and a common religion, of course. Peter destroyed this. He created rebellion wherever he went. And the only reason that Peter succeeded was that he defeated his opponents. Whether it be Mazeppa, Charles the 12th, the Streltsy, the Turks, the Persians, victory after victory, and there's nothing that solidifies a government in power like military victory. But they came at a massive cost. What we've been talking about, the relatively positive era of Elisabeth, was just, as I say, the light and the darkness. We dealt with the darkness today. Russia wanted to be European. They wanted luxuries. They wanted alcohol. They wanted worldly honors. They did not have this before. You had real classes develop. And the church was one of the institutions that suffered more than any. The similarities between Peter and the Bolsheviks are tremendous. And they were institutionalized under Peter. After him, it became sporadic. The only bright light you had was Elisabeth, who was an extraordinary woman, as we all know. The church would take a century to recover, and really never quite did. the old believers maintain the banner of old Russia, with all their problems and foibles. They do have that behind them. The state was not automatically deferred to. The church was not automatically deferred to. Because of all of this, you had a permanent chasm between the people and the state. You had questioning in the worst possible sense. You had relativism developing in the 19th century, as I've done many times before on this show. The Russian sexual revolution under the Masonic lodges in the late 19th century comes directly from this problem. Russia became just another European empire. And this is what Dostoevsky was mocking, what Gogol was mocking, this foreign Masonic Gnostic entity that ruled in St. Petersburg that had nothing to do with Russia. Anyway, thank you for listening, everyone. I'll talk to you next time. Bye-bye.